I'm Angela Kennecke, a veteran journalist with 30 years in television news and an investigative reporter. But for the purpose of this podcast, I'm just a mom trying to find my way after the loss of a child in the opioid epidemic. I am grieving out loud, using my platform on TV and on social media to try to stop the stigma of addiction and get more people into treatment so that no other family has to go through the devastation that I and my family have experienced at the loss of our 21-year-old Emily. I'm joined today by Mary Ann Giebink. Giebink was on top of her game as an attorney, but had it all come crashing down due to addiction in 2010. This once successful lawyer was disbarred after her very public struggle, which resulted in a prison sentence. Now she is using the skills she's learned through recovery in order to help others. Thanks for being here today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Really appreciate it, Mary Ann. You and I met a long time ago. I think it was about 29, 30 years ago that we first met. And you were working as an attorney at the time.
Yes, at least that long.
At least that long. And I remember being struck by a painting, and I don't always remember everything about every interview that I do, but I remember being struck by a painting that was hanging over your desk at the time. Tell me a little bit about that painting.
Well, my brother was in prison, and he was an artist, and he had drawn the pictures for my new office. He had plenty of time on his hands being in prison, so he drew all of the artwork for the office.
And it wasn't long after that that you lost your brother.
That's correct. Yes, he died by suicide in the in the Sioux Falls, South Dakota Penitentiary.
I always thought it was so interesting when I first met you. And of course, I was young. I didn't have a lot of life experience. But I thought, here's this woman, this very successful attorney, and her brother is in prison. And then a few decades later, you ended up in prison yourself. And I just think it's so interesting how the world can take so many turns.
Yes, my brother actually, and I don't think we, were aware enough about addiction, had addiction issues. I used to always think, you don't kill somebody because you're addicted to drugs. And I really struggled with that, very long, about why or how that could have happened. You've got a kid who is good-looking, fun-loving, just liked by everybody, and never had a violent bone in his body, commit this horrific crime. It just, it always bewildered me. And working in the field, of course, it was also very interesting because I had other cases that I would ponder about. Originally, when it happened, I remember somebody had told me that he had actually he had called in to River Park and tried to get in.
And River Park was a treatment center.
So he had tried to get into River Park, and it wasn't that long after that he ended up killing someone, at the age of 20. We had life without parole, and so the rest of his life was ruined by this horrific crime that he, committed. And he, 3.5 years later, then hung himself.
Where did addiction, how did that play a role in his life?
Well, I'm not sure because, like I said, it's 30 years ago. So, but I know that he always was, and I wrote a book about it. My daughter actually wrote the book. I'm the storyteller. She's the book writer.
You have a book of Phoenix, Rising from Addiction. And this is about how addiction has affected your own family in so many ways.
Right. And, I think from a very early age, Don was just a little different. I mean, he had some struggles, wasn't great at school, went to college in Mankato, dropped out. We didn't know about it. Just struggled with keeping a job and being able to take care of himself. And so I think there was this untreated addiction in there somewhere years before my brother's girlfriend was actually murdered. And I know there's a lot of discussion, in fact, on some of your podcasts about trauma and how that affects the brain. And, I think for the most part, there's still so much we don't know about addiction and why or how it happens. But definitely there's got to be some trauma in there, and there's got to be something probably in your brain that's different maybe than it is in some other people.
Right. Something gets triggered in some way.
Yeah.
So you, on the other hand, while your brother was in prison, kind of, if you want to call it the black sheep of the family, you, on the other hand, were this rising star, this powerful young female attorney in a time where you and I both had run into this early on in our careers, where there was a lot of a lot of struggles for women, getting into these fields that were male dominated.
Oh, very much so. I was one out of 7 women graduating from law class. In fact, watching the show about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I watched that with my mom and my daughter, and it brought back so many memories of things that happened as a young woman attorney that they would just be aghast to today.
Right. We hear those stories. But my point is that you were just doing great. You were on top of the world. You were on the top of your career. You enjoyed what you did.
I loved practicing law. I did.
So at what point was it to start with drinking? What had you always sort of had this tendency, or as you look back on yourself in those early years, when did it really start?
And there's actually a chapter in my book about the perfect storm. And we had a judge who committed suicide during a jury trial, had gone home for lunch and killed himself. There was a couple other attorneys that had committed suicide is not the correct term nowadays. It's died by suicide.
Completed, yeah.
Yes. And there was a couple other attorneys that had died by suicide. My mother-in-law, my father-in-law all died. There was a lot of sadness. There was just a lot of things. There was 2 triplets that had died in our neighborhood in a car crash. There was a lot of sadness, but I think for the most part, I had tried to get help after my brother's problem, and I'd gone to, some counseling, and
Was that more for dealing with grief at the time?
Yeah, but I did eventually do an outpatient treatment program. I'd had periods of sobriety. And so I think for the most part, after I did the outpatient treatment program, I knew I was a high-functioning alcoholic. And it just really caught up to me in kind of that midlife crisis period with a lot of that other stuff that went on right about that time. I knew I needed to retire. I actually retired at 47, but I just couldn't get out. There was just so much going on. I was moving my office. I had bought a historical building. I was running an office. I was running for office, all at the same time, and it just got
Why were you doing so much? Why were you? Because some of that's a choice, not all.
Right. I think that for the most part, I'd always been moving up the ladder, and I'd gotten to a point where I plateaued, and I had made all my goals. I knew I needed to make new goals, and I just couldn't think of anything. I'd lost all the joy. And I think that was the disease that took over, that there was some point where, the amygdala, for me, reacts differently to fear and stress. And for me, being an attorney practicing law, you have to maintain this kind of posture of being the strong person.
That's true for reporters, too, and anchor people. We see the worst. We tell people about the worst, but we have to always maintain our composure ourselves. That's what's expected, right? And that's very, you kind of compartmentalize, I think.
Right. You see kind of the bad side of life sometimes.
Yeah.
But for attorneys, you also have to keep secrets. And sometimes that's not healthy.
That client attorney privilege you're talking about. So how much were you was alcohol the thing of choice? I know.
No. I think anybody that has addictions will
go for anything.
Yeah, you lose sight of boundaries. For me, for the most part, marijuana had been my drug of choice all my years. But at the end, I was gambling, I was drinking, would have done pretty much anything. But I also, in fact, my husband believes for a large part of it was the addiction. Once I got prescription medicine from the doctors, played a huge role in it, because of course the medicine for depression or even for pain relief, I had TMJ, so I was getting muscle relaxers at one point. All of that along with the alcohol and drugs combination. It was just that perfect storm.
What's so interesting to me, and it may be even a really hard question to answer, but here you are, a successful attorney, and you're able to sort of, like we talked about, compartmentalize, do all these things. At the same time, you're drinking, using marijuana, perhaps other prescription drugs. You did some things, you were gambling. And how did you reconcile those two things in your brain at the time? And what I always want to get across to people is that addiction is a disease of the brain. So some of the things that people are doing and decisions they're making during those moments are not rational decisions. They're not something that you're thinking out, oh, I'm going to do this next, and then I'm going to do that next. Was it a series of you just sort of like losing your way, losing who you were?
I think for somebody that doesn't have addiction, it's hard to understand because nothing else matters. So the rationality that you're talking about, that pre-thinking process that you're talking about.
Yeah, you're thinking.
Sure, I'm thinking I shouldn't be doing this, but the addiction is in more control. It doesn't matter because there's an automatic need for that drug or alcohol or whatever it is. One of my friends always talks about, king alcohol in the corner pumping iron, because that is more powerful than any rational thought that you have. And I think for somebody that has never experienced that, they just really can't understand. Most people think, well, if you can't drink, just don't.
Right, just
and
stop. Stop.
Those people are not addicts.
And they blame the addict. I mean, I run across that a lot, especially when there's all this stigma surrounding. I mean, alcohol is so socially acceptable. Marijuana is so socially acceptable now, in so many places and many circles. But you have a kid who's using heroin. That, well, geez, why would they do that? Just stop.
Well, an addiction is addiction is addiction. It doesn't matter what they use.
But don't you agree?
It doesn't matter if it's video games. It doesn't
Right.
matter if it's sex or food. There's so many addictions out there.
But don't you agree that certain addictions are a little more socially acceptable than other addictions? I mean, are other certain uses of chemicals?
Well, there's some things that are legal and there's some things that are illegal. I mean, that's definitely true. But I think even for the addict or the alcoholic, or some people don't use those terms, don't want to use those terms. They want to say
substance use disorder.
I use the person of concern.
Okay.
They don't factor in that it's a disease. In fact, it took me, I think I was sober 3 years before that message really hit. As educated and as intelligent as I am.
Yeah, that's
right?
what I'm looking at you
First
a
time I
little
went
incredulously because I'm surprised it took 3 years for you to really understand that you had a disease of the brain.
Well, but the first time I got treatment was in prison. I mean, real treatment, intense treatment. I had outpatient treatment in my 20s, but when I really got the information was in prison. And your brain doesn't work. I mean, that's one of the reasons I wanted to come and do this was because a lot of people think that it's a choice and that they need to you have to wait until they're ready to make that choice to get better. And you can't make that choice.
Why can't you make that choice?
Because there's something in your brain that has stopped allowing you to. There's an automatic need for that drug or alcohol. Or whatever it is that you're addicted to.
I try to explain to people, from what I've learned, that it becomes more important than the basic needs, Maslow's basic needs. It becomes more important than food, shelter, taking care of your young. Just getting that drug again, that fix again, becomes the most important thing to the brain. It tells you that it's the most important thing.
I remember the first time I had a case where the mother was addicted to gambling. And she broke her kid's piggy bank in front of the child to get money to go gamble. And I remember being horrified at that. I remember being horrified to when we started the 24/7, that society doesn't trust you to such an extent that you have to go in twice a day for them to check up on you. But as much as you know about the addiction, it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to stop it in yourself just because you have self-knowledge. In fact, this is how I realized that it was a disease. I had done an interview with Kello. I was working at Keystone. I worked for Keystone for 3 years
After you got out of prison?
Well, I actually worked at Taco John's first and then Culver's.
That was humbling, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was very good. And
it was good.
Yeah, it was very good. So she was talking about the brain disease on the interview. And Brad, my husband, had said, well, wasn't that interesting about the brain disease? And I was like, I'd seen it a couple times, and I'm like, what are you talking about? I had to go back and watch it again. And that's the key, I think, that most people don't realize. It's a brain disease, so it's very difficult for them to decide, I need to get better. They know they may know they need to get better, but they can't make that choice.
Part of them knows it.
Yeah.
I think always there's part inside that knows that what they're doing isn't right or good for them or good for the people who love them.
And that's the key is they don't want to be hurting the people around them. They don't want to be doing the things that they're wanting to do. They don't want to steal or lie to get what they have. And what's really strange is to see people that you know and love do those things and not being able to reconcile it.
Which just often causes the need to use more because they feel so guilty about the things they've done.
Exactly.
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this idea of rock bottom, because in the world's eyes, in a way, you hit rock bottom. You lost, you were licensed to practice law. You lost your freedom. I mean, there's so many things that you lost. Was that rock bottom?
No, I really believe that rock bottom is death. I think that we can raise their bottom so that they don't, I always say I'm kind of the cautionary tale. Don't do it the way I did. But I really hit rock bottom a couple times before that. Before the public part of it. Right. You never know what's really going to make a difference for someone. And that's why having that loving, caring, I call them the recovery network around them to help them with those times when they go through that, it's very important. I actually was visiting a friend of mine who was 49 dying from lung cancer in Arizona. And my husband and my mom and my daughter were very attuned to what was going on with me, although I was denying it. And my husband, I was on the phone with him, and he said he needed to do an intervention on me. Well, the wrong time to tell me while I'm out of state, right? Because I'm actually, always the person of concern is always probably smarter than you. They think they are anyway.
Yeah, they think
so I came home and moved out, right? And continued to get worse, much worse at that point, because I had nobody right there, one-on-one with me, watching what I was doing. So that's one of the reasons why I was interested in doing interventions, to help families kind of maneuver through that process.
Yeah, I had a really wise friend who lost two brothers, one to an overdose and one who was a meth addict to suicide. And she told me when we were dealing with my daughter, because everyone always tells you, oh, they have to want it. Oh, you have to wait until they hit rock bottom. And she told me, rock bottom is death or brain damage. She said, you cannot wait for people to hit rock bottom. But as somebody who's been on the other side of this, as a family member, watching somebody make poor choices, knowing that something is wrong, not having them be honest with you, not having them be willing to go in for treatment, it is the most frustrating thing. I always liken it to standing in front of a freight train and putting my hands up, and the freight train ran me over. I mean, my daughter died from an overdose. I have another friend whose son died who says it's like a tornado for the family members. You're caught up in this, and you're seeking help, and you're up all night looking online, you're calling people, you're going to counselors, you're trying all these things, but nothing's really working. Why is it so hard to get people help?
Well, most of it's lack of information and uninformed, and a lack of resources. It's amazing once you start learning about it, how much there is out there that you didn't know, that you talked about, the warning signs, the things that you can do. That's why I think going to experts in the field, having somebody help you maneuver through those minefields. When I do an intervention, my interventions are not just for that moment of getting them into treatment. It's for the whole family, because it's a family illness. And everybody needs to get educated, and everybody needs to get informed, and everybody probably needs to get into different kinds of recovery programming. But the other thing is it's a 2 to 5 year process. It's not just getting them into treatment.
Right, because it's not a magic cure-all. Don't you think, though, in this day and age, with fentanyl being out there and fentanyl being in the drug supply, it is such a dangerous time to have this problem?
It is. And, I think it's always been, but now it's a little bit more heightened because of the drugs.
Right.
I think that for the most part, what I do is I try to help people get through the minefields, and that's why it's interesting to have that law background, because there's a lot of things that are involving in regards to the criminal stuff. They may have criminal cases, but, or we a lot of times need an involuntary commitment, or 2 or 3.
Which can be tough to get, too, and quite a process.
I have not had great success with court-appointed attorneys doing involuntary commitments. That's something I'd love to get some more work into. But I do have private attorneys that I can hire that are much, more maybe accessible or readily available to do what needs to get done. But yeah, and that costs money.
Right.
We always try the public defender's way first, and there's always room for improvement on the process. But sometimes that's the key, is to get an involuntary, because when you're dealing with adults, it's
Right.
different when you have a juvenile.
Right.
You may need that involuntary commitment.
So tell me a little bit about how an intervention works, because I think we all have preconceived ideas of how an intervention works. We've seen the show, right?
Right.
How does it actually work? How does it play out?
Well, in the one that I've been trained in, it's a RISE training. You move on it real quickly. You get a call from a mom or somebody that's concerned, business owner, and you get a little bit of information. You set up the meeting and you invite that individual in. The reason why I do that is because I don't want the individual, the person of concern, to think that I've made alliances with other people around them. I want them to know that I'm a neutral party, that I'm here just for, to get, the help that individual needs, and that everybody that's there loves and cares for them. And
I went through a gamut of emotions when I was setting up this intervention for Emily, the one we never got to carry out. It was,
Right.
when it was within a week's time, the time we met with the interventionist to the time we were going to do the intervention. We were writing our letters and all that. I remember going through a gamut of emotions thinking, what if I'm wrong? What if she's not really on some harder drug that I think she's on? What if she hates me forever? What if she never speaks to me? There were lots of thoughts, and I knew it was the right thing to do, and we were going to go ahead with it. But I remember just being extremely stressed out about even doing this.
Right, because it's a family illness. It affects everybody around you.
And every time I had confronted her in the past, she'd gotten so angry with me, and then she'd disappear for a day or two and not talk to me as a punishment. I really felt like I don't know what else I could have done.
Well, we don't want you to know. We're really good at being manipulative. That's the disease of kind of the nature of the beast. We climb inside ourselves. We have low self-esteem, and yet we have these grandiosity also. It's like we're at the bottom of the heap, we're at the top of the heap.
I know exactly what you mean by that, and not just with my daughter, but with other addictive people who suffer from addictions in my family.
In fact, we all kind of, there's so many people that have addiction, and they come from all walks of life, and it's kind of like an hourglass. So at the top, we all come from different areas, but in the middle, we all look the same. But we get out of addiction all in different ways. There's no one, way to do it. And so for some people, tall grass works well. That's a recovery center. It's an indoctrination of the 12 steps.
So we're talking about different, like medically assisted treatment, 12 steps. I mean, there's all different kinds of treatment. Well, maybe there aren't as many as we need, but there are different types of routes to take to recovery.
Well, and that's why having an expert in the area that knows all of your options, sometimes a drug patch is important, sometimes an ankle monitor, the 24/7. You can do those voluntarily. So Glory House has those available.
Let's get back to you. You get this call. You try to act as quickly as possible, invite this person to the meeting. Is there always resistance from the person?
Yeah, generally.
Almost
sometimes most of the time, about 80%, I don't want, I know I need to go, but just not today. And so, generally
And people have a million excuses. I mean, a lot of people are functioning. They might be working, or they,
by
have
the time
a child or a dog, or
by the time I come into the game, they've tried a lot of different options. And so about 20% are resistant, I would say.
And so
and
do
that's
they
when you have to do maybe the involuntary commitment.
Okay. So you go and you meet with the family, with the person, with the concerned people around the loved one or the friend or whomever. 20% of the time they'll just say no way, and then you have to take this other route.
Then you have to, have them maybe put into detox and have a hearing, and
How does that go?
You know what? They
does
get
it
sober.
matter?
They
does
get
it matter
sober.
how people?
They're alive.
So this is my question. Does it matter if they are forced into treatment or if they go willingly, as long as they get treatment in the end?
Well, everybody's different. Everybody's different. It just depends on what the plan is. Some of them are 20, some of them are 40. They react differently. A 20-year-old may, need to go into a halfway house after they come out, and maybe be out of town because that's where their drug buddies are.
Right. Well, so
Yeah.
let's talk about recovery, because that's the thing. I think I just got done talking to a friend of mine this week who's I've had on the podcast. She and her another woman have opened up a series of sober living homes. Well, boy, have they had the people already just coming through. They'll start and they'll relapse right away. These are people who really want they're there because they want to be there in these sober living homes. They want to get better. They want, and they're surrounding themselves in an environment where they aren't around the drugs, but yet it just seems to already be a revolving door.
Yeah, I was so happy to see them come because we don't have enough.
Oh, I know.
There's never enough beds. But, I mean, they're on the war front. They are right on the line, and it's tough. You have to have people that are, have long-term sobriety for one thing, that are helping, so that they can see the signs and recognize them. But you also maybe have, need, like, I love the way they've got it set up, because I believe they have to have a sponsor, they have to go to meetings, or, they have a program. It's not just that they can live there and they have to be sober. There's got to be some accountability. But there's all other kinds of ways, like we talked about, the ankle monitor, the drug patches. There's other things, because for some people, they can't do it on their own. They need to have some kind of outward source that helps them get through that year period, because it takes a year for your brain to recover.
Yeah, 13 to 18 months. Yeah,
or
according
more.
to brain scans.
And for me, what really helped was the ankle monitor.
That's what I was going to ask you, because what did it take for you to
I
not
did
relapse?
24/7. I did the ankle monitor. And the ankle monitor seemed to modify my thinking. So I would have a good day. I should be able to go have a drink, right? I'd have a bad day, definitely need a drink. And I'd think, oh, no, that's not a choice. And slowly those thoughts would go away.
Right, so it was changing the thought patterns in your brain.
Yeah, I was actually able to thank the judge that I had, because even though I didn't want to go through what I went through, it got me sober. It's interesting because a lot of people think, oh my gosh, you went to prison, how horrible, how awful. And it was not a pleasant experience. But it was the best thing that happened to me, because I'm not sure I would have gotten sober any other way. I was so sure of myself and lacking humility that I'm not sure I would have gotten it any other way. In fact, working at Culver's or Taco John's, great experience for me. Horribly difficult. People that would come in that I would know, and I'd want to run to the back room and clean the cupboards.
Right. So there goes your ego, right? So your ego, you have to check your ego at the door after you're an attorney, you're esteemed, in our society, you've worked hard, you had a lot of education, and here you are doing things that many of your clients, I'm sure, had to do, or people were up against in the courtroom.
Yeah.
Go to prison, work minimum wage jobs.
And for the most part, I did it to myself, because they'd walk in the door and I would just feel horrible, because I didn't know how to feel as a person somebody that has an addiction. That's the crux of what is missing. We don't know what to do with our feelings. We react differently to fear and stress. And so when they would walk in the door and I'd have this emotional reaction,
like a gut punch kind of thing.
Yeah, I would still have to put on a good face and help them and be pleasant. And they were genuinely nice. They were very kind. Most people are going to talk about you. They're going to talk behind your back anyway.
It's true.
But they were kind, and so I realized that it was something that I was doing to myself, and I was the one that had to let it go.
Now let me ask you this, and I'm just kind of asking you this from a parent's perspective. In your family, I don't know how many cases of addiction, but obviously your brother had addiction and mental health issues. You had those addiction issues. Was there something in your upbringing? Was there something? Is it in your family? Did you have a parent with addiction issues?
I don't think you can figure it out. But one of the things that we do in the intervention process is we do a genogram. So we start with the person of concern, and we talk about their parents and their children and go all the way up 5 generations. And then you talk about whether or not there's mental illness, whether or not there's addiction in any of these individuals, whether or not somebody has died by suicide, whether or not, there's been a car accident or there were soldiers that came back from the war. And as you draw this genogram, everybody's family has it. Yes. Everybody's family. And it comes down. And in fact, the gal that I trained with, she talks about how really all of us are immigrants from Europe and how traumatic that was to put everything you had in a suitcase and come over here. And that's part of the reason why maybe, the United States has a higher numbers than maybe
I always
some
say
other
we're
places.
a drug culture. There's a pill for everything out there. You go to the doctor, whatever is ailing you, there's a pill.
Well, and that's a little bit of the capitalist society, too, to try and put more money in our pockets, sell more pills.
Right. And then on social media with kids, there's a certain kind of drug culture there and certain music and I just think it's just so prevalent.
Well,
and normalized.
We didn't talk about this stuff. When that happened with my brother, I just bucked up, and I went to work and put my nose to the grindstone. And I loved it when people asked me about him or talked about him. But for the most part, you weren't really supposed to show your emotions. It wasn't really cool to cry in public. People are getting better about that it's, it's more acceptable.
More vulnerability.
Right. To talk about if you're sad. I remember having lunch with girlfriends and they'd cry and thinking how I admired them. And I felt so different from them because I could never cry in front of somebody else.
Because you'd shut down that part of yourself. Yeah. So what are the takeaway for people to know about interventions? Like, when do you do an intervention? How typically does it go? How expensive is it? How do you know if you need to do an intervention?
Well, that's why I love your podcast, because I think it gets information out there. I think the information from the doctors that you've had on here was vital. The more you can learn, the more you can know about it. Just continue to read, ask questions, learn about it. But anytime that you've got a real concern, you need to talk to somebody about it. You need to, secrets keep us sick. You need to talk to somebody, ask questions. Like you said, your mom instincts, if there's something going on, then you need to address it. If they aren't using drugs, great. No harm done. Right. If they are, the risk is just too great.
I just think that denial part is so strong on the part of most people suffering from substance use disorder. And it comes right at the family, that denial that anything's wrong. And it's just so hard to break down that wall of denial.
Well, but we are also really good at manipulating our loved ones, about convincing them that there's nothing wrong. But if you've got medical things happening, or you've got financial or, legal things happening, you need to have some help.
And what would you like to see change the most in society or in how we treat this issue and these medical problems?
Well, we don't have enough time, I'm sure, for all of the things that need changing. We need more resources for sure. I love the gentleman that was talking about the triage, that we don't need just the triage. We need the jails, we need the emergency rooms, all of those to be recommending, resources, but there aren't enough resources. I have to tell you about one particular case that I had a meth user who, Interventionist, had committed some crimes. The mother and I were in court. We were in court. He failed to appear. The bond, after I explained it to the judge, there was no bond set. This was a Monday. On Friday, they arrested him, and he was PR'd because there was no room in the jail. There was also an IVC hold on him, and they would not hold him because there was no room in the detox unit. There's never enough resources. It's really an epidemic. I love it that our public figures are talking about it, but then we need to put some action into it. We need to put some money into it, and it just can't be mouth service. For a person that has an addiction, they need to start over and learn life all over again. And sometimes, like the Arch, and there's a number of places around town where they have very strict rules. As a person who doesn't think the rules apply to them, it's good to get back into that setting to have kind of a framework of how to start over. And if somebody, has that for a short period of time until they can get it on their own, it's very helpful.
I've heard an idea from actually the Davidson County Sheriff in Mitchell said we should take some of these nursing homes that are vacant right now and turn those into recovery towns, places where people had to go. They were sentenced to go there. They were committed or whatever. But it was all about recovery. They had to, spend their time there and working on recovery. And I don't know why it's so hard for us to get from an idea like that to actually doing something along those lines.
That's interesting because I was actually out at a conference in Boston when I was working for the Glory House, and I think it was Ohio, where the governor had actually taken a whole prison and turned it into a recovery center, a re-entry center. And it was very successful. The recidivism goes down, people get well, they get jobs, they, become citizens that are paying taxes. Yeah, unfortunately, our prisons have now become our mental institutions that we used to think was awful.
Right. Back in the Clinton era, they let everybody out of the mental institutions that were being held, and now you're right. Now the problems with drugs are also problems with mental illness.
Well, because 80% of people that have addiction issues have co-occurring mental illness.
It's hard. It's like the chicken and the egg. What does it one cause the other? Did they already have one? Were they self-medicating? And probably a little bit of both.
Well, those statistics are about the same as to how many people are in prison generally have addiction and mental health issues.
Yeah.
So that would be my first thing to start.
And you're doing your part in this little corner of the world. Do you ever get tired of it? You've been through so much. You've been through so much with your own personal struggles, your personal demons and battles and recovery. And here you are out helping other people and making that your full-time career. Do you ever get tired of it?
It's very similar to practicing law because as a practicing attorney, I did over 50 jury trials. And there's something very powerful about convincing 12 people you're right. Now you have one. But I think for me, using the legal and the recovery experience that I have really everything in my life led me to where I am right now. I love helping families and people get well. And it is a real difficult thing to do. I think it's simple, but it's not easy.
And because it's not always successful, there's no guarantees.
Well, there's different levels of success. It's interesting because a lot of the family members get well. Sometimes maybe the individual that you're concerned about is more of it's a long struggle. But the people around them get more educated about what's going on. And as an attorney, you have just a wide wealth of knowledge when it comes to different and resources. For me, I know a lot of people in the recovery area. So if I don't know something, I know where to go to ask questions about it. I'm really excited about the new addiction recovery center with Avera. It's like I said, there's never enough resources, and I'm so excited about that.
Well, right, but they said they could start building another wing today.
Oh, yeah.
It hasn't even opened yet. It opens, late fall here. So it's a sad statement that this is such a huge issue in our society. But thank you for the part that you're doing, what you're doing to help people and families get better.
Yeah, well, it's my pleasure. It's my honor to be able to be there to help them.
Thank you. I believe we can all learn from each other as we walk through life, and by sharing our suffering, we can lessen the suffering of others. Until next time, wishing you faith, hope, and courage. To read my blogs and join us in our mission, just go to Emily's Hope at paintingapathttorecovery.org. Also, please rate and review this podcast. Thank you.